There we go.
Something's happening.
No, I think my recording right there.
And then we're gonna sell the recordings. Support the church. All right, let's get serious here. Let's open, well, let's first just a word of explanation and then prayer. This is the book of Daniel. How many have read it? Wow. It's a little bit of an unusual book. I will give credit to Shawn for suggesting this particular book. We talked about what we were going to teach, and she suggested this, and I said, okay, I've never taught Daniel in my life. So, but anyway, we'll work on that, and we will tag team. I'm starting tonight. For the next 2 weeks, Shawn is going to be teaching. We'll go somewhat back and forth as it goes on, and we don't really know how long it's going. There are 12 chapters in Daniel, but we're not necessarily going to say, okay, we take a chapter a night, and that's it. And in some cases, it may, at least I think Shawn and I are on the same page about this. We will take as long as it takes to get through it. Not that we want to drag. So, you know, if you say, hey, come on, let us know and signal that. But we do want to take the time to study it. It's just an unusual book. So, without any further ado, let's pray and then we'll jump in. Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather together in front of your word and just be with us as we read through this and study this and reflect on events of 3,000 years ago that we may seem sometimes to be really strange and have little or no connection with us, and yet they do have connection with us because it's all under you in your world. And Daniel was a person like us in a different time, in a different place, in different situations, but there's nothing that he went through that in the end is completely different, nothing that's completely different from what we face in our lives. So help us as we go through this during these weeks to grow in understanding your will and your way. In Jesus' name, amen. I opened with a statement, and then somewhere in college I was told you don't say that let me read what I'm saying. I'm sorry. Every book of the Bible is unique, but the book of Daniel seems more unique than most of the others. And somewhere along in college, I was told there is no such thing as more unique. Because if it's unique, so something can't be more unique. But I wanted to kind of jokingly make a point that Daniel does stand out. So that's the smiley face there. So I want to look at some of the characteristics of this book and its author that set it apart. And by the way, if stop me, rap on the table, raise your hand if I'm just rolling along. Don't hesitate to stop. Again, the point is not to see how fast we can get through this. Every other prophet in the Bible, including Daniel's contemporary Ezekiel, who arrived presumably arrived in Babylonia or that area, general area. What did I say there? 8 to 10 years before Daniel probably did. I mean, some of this is a little bit of guesswork. It's a different kind of thing, and we'll get into those details. I'm going to talk a whole lot about the details tonight because we're going to go through the book in detail. This is an introduction. But so Ezekiel and Daniel were both in Mesopotamia, in the general area about the same time. But Daniel had been taken to the court probably about 8 to 10 years earlier. And unlike Ezekiel and all the other prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, remember all the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Lamentations is not a prophet. It's a prophetic book, and so on. And Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, John, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zechariah, Malachi, whatever. I think I left something out. Anyway, all of those people all spoke among their own people. But as far as we know, Daniel didn't. Daniel was at the court. He was among a group of young men taken to the court. We'll talk about that. to serve there, to serve there. So he, as far as we know, proclaimed his message to Nebuchadnezzar and to his court. Okay, we include
Can I
Dan.
pause you?
Yes.
So I think it's important to note that Jeremiah's, the other prophet of that time, stayed behind in Judah.
Okay.
And he's the one that prophesied, warned and warned and warned, and then prophesied the 70-year exile. And the other thing that I wanted to just at least discuss, because I don't know if everybody knows, where's Mesopotamia?
Oh, Mesopotamia. Okay.
And what is it today? Like Babylon is modern day Iraq
Yeah,
area.
right.
So, and that's good to know
It's
because
a bit vague.
it's that area though. I didn't know if everybody knew that.
Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers.
Yeah.
And and I have to look at a map to get that straight. We probably could have had a map here. But it's,
The
we said
Euphrates.
Iraq, but the Tigris and Euphrates are in that area, but that's a little bit vague. But it is Iraq,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Okay, so, yeah.
It's just good to know that because that's relevant to some of the prophetic stuff.
Yes, it is. We get into that later. Yes, yes, it is. So, okay, so Daniel and Ezekiel were both there. Ezekiel was with a kind of steal a pen. Ezekiel was with a separate. These are people that are taken captives. Both Ezekiel and Daniel are taken captives into that area. They're Jews, but they're taken there, and at different times, different places. Daniel, as we'll find out, was part of a very special group taken to the court to serve there. So anyway, we include that among the other prophecies. But when the Jewish people, from the Jewish, let's see, who's this? Just like the priests, help me out, Sean.
I'm not sure what you're
Well, when they put together the canon, okay,
Yes.
Canon. That's a Latin word really that means rule. And we talk about the canon of the Bible, and the canon of the Bible are the books that were at some point or another determined that this is really God's word and belongs. It fits into the canon, or into the rule that, and we could spend the rest of this whole class for the next few weeks talking about canon and how that works and how that developed. Maybe we'll do that some night, but that's not our purpose. But the Jews developed a canon of the Old Testament. And as Christians, we pretty much inherited that. These are the books that the Jews considered. These are really prophetic books, God's word, things that we need to study, we need to know, that we need to believe. And there's three parts to the canon of the Old Testament. The first part is, yes, anybody have a guess? What's the first part of the Old Testament canon?
The Torah.
The Torah, the Pentateuch, the Law,
Yeah.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Mhm.
Those 5 books are the books of Moses. Moses wrote them, or was inspired by God to write them. So those are considered the law, and that and that's probably the most important part of the Jewish canon, the Torah, the law. The second part would be the prophets, and that would be, well, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then there are 12 prophets that we count, that I started to name off before. But for the Jewish people, that was only one book. That was the book of the 12. They're called minor just because they're shorter. They're not intended to, not a put down, well, these are the major prophets, and those are just the minor ones. But they are shorter books. So, but there's the Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel were the major. No, I'm sorry, I'm missing. You better catch me on
Isaiah,
Sean to keep me on track.
Jeremiah,
Well, there's First and
Zechariah.
Second Samuel is
Yes.
also considered prophets. First and Second Kings is also considered prophets. So those First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Those are the prophets. Everything else in the Old Testament was considered, well, sometimes it's the sacred writings.
The
There's some
writings, yeah.
different terms on it, writings. And it began with the book called the Psalms. And the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, everything else that doesn't fit into the law or doesn't fit into those specific prophets, it's there. And the Jews, when they read Daniel, instead of putting him in with the prophets, they put him in with that group of books, which is a little bit strange because we say, well, it's a prophetic book. But Daniel, as we'll find out, is not exactly a typical prophetic book. It's a bit strange, a bit different. So they considered it sacred, but they didn't include it as a prophet. I did want to make, I think there's a note in the, well, it's kind of in the footnote, a couple of footnotes on the bottom. I'll draw your attention down there. First of all, speaking of Ezekiel and Daniel, they were contemporaries. They were in the same part of the world at the same time, but we don't really know if they knew each other or not. There is, in the footnote, it mentions, way down the bottom of the page, Ezekiel speaks of a Daniel in his prophecy in a couple of places, chapter 14, verses 14 and 20, and also chapter 28, verse 3. But it's not certain that it's the same Daniel as this Daniel.
Can I say something about that?
You can say anything you want.
I think it's very clear that it is the same Daniel, because I think it's in chapter 28 where he speaks of the extraordinary wisdom of this Daniel.
Okay.
I think it has to be the same Daniel.
Well, the reason I challenge that, and
Okay.
I'm not going to disagree because I'm not going to fight, but the argument against that is that Ezekiel and Daniel are contemporaries. And one of the places where he speaks of this wonderful man Daniel, he speaks it in the context with Job and Noah and Daniel. Now, Job and Noah were much more ancient, and Ezekiel counts Daniel. And so some people would say, this is a bit strange. You know, maybe there's another Daniel. Now, the jury's out on that. I'm not going to disagree with Shawn. She could well be right. I'm not sure I'm right by any means. But there is that question. Ezekiel speaks of Daniel. Does he mean this Daniel, or does he mean somebody else named Daniel? I don't know. But Shawn does.
It's just an opinion.
No,
It's a strong opinion.
If you don't know, Shawn and I work together enough that we have a pretty good relationship. We can joke about this, and I have a lot of respect for her, and I think she has
Likewise.
respect for me, so we do okay. So if we argue, we're never going to throw anything in. Anyway, it seems very likely that they knew each other, but it's not certain that they did. And Ezekiel may have known of Daniel without really knowing him closely, too. There's all different things there. All right. I was starting to talk about they put Daniel in with Psalms, Proverbs, Job, blah, 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 blah. And that group for the Jews was usually called the Psalms. Not because they were all Psalms, but because that was the big, first important book of that section. And so I have this quote from Jesus in Luke 24, verse 44. When Jesus says, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And there's a reason why he says those three things, because those are the three parts of the Hebrew Bible. Hey, good evening, good evening. Welcome. We have to,
Yeah, come on in.
No, come in, we'll make the rounds.
We gotta scoot around.
Don't feel bad. Things get confused. They're probably you're not the only person who's confused.
We like each other, we're okay. Right, maybe close.
By the way, this is Michael and Margaret, who've been in church for the last couple Sundays, and we met with them on Sunday, and we twisted their arm and said, if you don't come Wednesday night, you're not my friend.
Wow.
But I don't even remember your last names.
Stevens. Stevens.
Stevens, okay.
Welcome.
I don't know, I shouldn't say I don't remember it, I'm not sure I even knew it. Anyway, okay, maybe we'll introduce afterwards or take a break and do that. So, anyway, this is Mike and Margaret, so welcome. Thank you. Did you have copies of?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've got a spare one. You don't have to share, unless you want to.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so anyway, where are we? Okay, this was the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. We're at about the middle of the first page here. So they accepted Daniel as inspired sacred book, but they did not consider it as similar to the other prophets. So we kind of have some. All right. Daniel's prophetic gifting and faith and that of his 3 Jewish companions. Oh, who are those 3 Jewish companions? Well, we'll get to that in a second. I didn't put it in there. So impressed the heathen captors and rulers that he served that they again and again acknowledged the wisdom and power of God. All right. I probably should have. Well, I didn't really want to get into the book itself. Because next week,
We'll
Sean,
do that next week.
we're going to do this. But you guys may probably have heard the story, okay? Daniel, not Shadrach. Yeah, Daniel. No. I always forget the Hebrew names. I have to look at that. Is it there? Not in there? Well, those are the Babylonian names.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know the 3 guys in the fiery furnace, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and those are not their, somewhere down here, I've got their Hebrew names, but anyway, Daniel and those 3 guys, along with some others, as far as that goes, it wasn't just those 4, but when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in about 600, there's a whole lot of history that I'm passing over lightly. But they chose, these guys were chosen to go to Babylon and serve in the courtyard because they were, did I put something in? Yes, I did. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's all right. We'll get into it. Those 3 guys, okay, we know these stories, okay. I'm sorry. Daniel's prophetic gifting and faith and that of his 3 Jewish companions so impressed the heathen captors and rulers that he served that they again and again acknowledged the wisdom and power of God. For example, in Daniel chapter 2, which we'll get into in a couple weeks, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel interprets it for him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the 3 men in the fiery furnace, right? All of us who ever went to Sunday school anywhere know that one. And that impressed Nebuchadnezzar and the people involved and so forth. Daniel in the lion's den. Which is not Nebuchadnezzar, that's under Cyrus, I think that actually takes place, but whatever. So they all were impressed by them, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like they ever quite acknowledge that, well, these are the true God, this is the true God. They, there's that same thing that happens in the world today. People may acknowledge, oh, God is really special, but so is our God, so is what we do. I don't know. Human beings are pretty finicky about being faithful to the true God, and it doesn't automatically happen, even when people are impressed with God. That was
Can I say something about
yes,
that?
you can. You do.
The thing that's interesting about that is, of course, all the ancient empires and what have you, ancient cultures, they were all pantheistic.
Yes.
And
That's
the belief generally was that if you conquered another nation, well, your God was the better God, the stronger God. And so even though, yeah, Daniel's God, well, he's powerful, but we still conquered you,
We're still in charge.
you know? So they were coming up against that too.
Good point, good point. Very good. So that's, anyway, so he impressed the heathen captors and so forth, but they were not necessarily automatically convinced or changed. Third point, towards the bottom of the page, Daniel also stands apart from other Old Testament books because not all of it was written in Hebrew. Well, about half of it was written in Hebrew in general. But there's a whole section from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 7, verse 28, which I think is the last verse of chapter 7, was written in Aramaic. And Aramaic and Hebrew are related. They're all part of what you call generally a Semitic language. Well, Arabic in a way would come out of that too in the long run, but this is before Arabic as we would know it existed. But that section was written in Aramaic, and as far as I understand, it was something like the common language of some of that area, of the Near East, of Iraq, and so forth. And so on. They're, just as English today is the
Sure.
common
Translate it to which
language
language?
of the world. What was that?
My watch is talking back to me.
Okay. You know, I get a kick out of it because I don't know if this, English is sometimes called the lingua franca, which means it's the French language of today. Because a couple hundred years ago, the language of culture, the language of the world, or the Western world, was French. You know, that was, everything was internationally was done French. Ever since the last 100 or 200 years, English kind of, we don't want that French. We're going to speak English. So, and we don't maybe realize, unless you traveled overseas or lived overseas, don't realize what a blessing it is to know English, because you can go almost anywhere in the world and probably find somebody who knows enough English to translate for you. And so you can kind of get by, I mean, unless you get really off in the countryside somewhere, and you can run into places where nobody knows what you're saying. But, we lived in Taiwan for 15 years and we learned Taiwanese, but you know, you could function without learning it if you had to. You could always find somebody who could translate for you. Anyway, where am I? So Aramaic was that. So, but anyway, that whole section, that particular section from Daniel chapter 2 through chapter 7, deals a lot with prophesying about the God's warning to the nations that did not know or worship the true God. So that seems to be the reason, that section was written in Aramaic. And it seems to imply that Daniel was a wise enough and intelligent enough young man who learned to speak and write in Aramaic. He did not, was not limited to his own mother tongue, but was able to function in that international language. So that sets Daniel apart from the other books. All right, okay, now here's where I was going to start. I was getting ahead of myself for a while. The book of Daniel begins with a record of an event that can be accurately placed in the timeline of world history. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. That's the first verse of Daniel 1. Now, a little bit of explanation, and we could spend all night just talking about this. This Jehoiakim is the king of Judah. I did pass out, and if you've got that, this would be a good time to look at the chronology. I'll give you one of those here too. Yep, there's two of them.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so for now, I'll take this one. You can have, that's got the whole thing. A little bit here. Okay. All right, the first page of that, not the first page, but actually the second page. I'll just skip to that where it says prehistory before 2000 BC, okay? And this chronology just says Genesis 1 through 11 is before 2000 BC. I'm not going to go there and mess with that, but really clearly datable history begins kind of around 2000 BC. And that's the time of Abraham. 1900 is like Isaac, 1800 Jacob, 1750 Joseph's life. And you know your Old Testament and all, you kind of know that. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob has his 12 sons, and Joseph gets sent sold as a slave to Egypt, and so forth and so on. So those are round numbers. Those are rather vague and round numbers. Around 1500, 1440, Moses is. I've lost track of how many generations from Joseph to Moses, but it's a few generations. And Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt. They conquer the promised land and so forth. And I'm going to jump down here. We could spend too much time on this. Down to the bottom, the last section on that first page, Israel's united monarchy around sometime before 1000 BC. Saul reigns as the first king in Israel. We're skipping over some history there, but and then around 1000 BC, David. In round numbers, that's a good term. 3,000 years ago, a little bit more than 3,000 years ago, David was the first king, the first of his line. And then Solomon, and I know I'm sure you all have heard some of that history at one time or another. The next page then goes on to talk about what happens. Unfortunately, that, let's see, I must have it. I've got other pages. Oh, well, I'll still, okay, there we go. Don't be sorry. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm prepared here. All right. Around on top of that page, it says Israel's divided monarchy, 931 to 587 BC. After David and after Solomon, and Solomon's son was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, instead of trying to keep the country together, there was kind of a civil war, okay? And the north kind of split off, and Rehoboam was not a particularly good king, and anyway, lots of different things happened. From that time on, there's two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom, which is usually called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. Now, some of that will sound familiar if you know your Bible, but it gets confusing. And so there's two kingdoms and so forth. And this northern kingdom goes bad pretty fast. There's hardly a good king. As long as it lasts, there's not much good going, and they get carried off into captivity. And then with the southern kingdom, kind of there's a good king and there's a bad king and not so good king, and there's some good times and bad times. And that's where we are. I'm getting this. I should have. All right. So anyway, where was I? I'm sorry. Okay. There was a time then when Judah is captured by Nebuchadnezzar, and that's around 600, give or take. 600 BC. So the southern kingdom lasts about 400 years. And then that goes into captivity. And Daniel in Daniel chapter, this is, okay, now I'm back into the prepared notes, okay? About the second, in the first paragraph, it says, about 605 BC, the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim along with some of the articles from the temple of God and brought them back to Babylon. And then he also, and that's an important paragraph here, the chapter goes on to say that Nebuchadnezzar also ordered that some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And we'll learn more about those details when we go through that, when Shawn goes through that. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, and all this dark stuff is in quotes from Daniel 1. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and those are their Hebrew names. But the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Ariah, Abednego, and so forth. These are all young men, probably only teenagers. We don't really know for sure, but they're generally pretty young, and they're pretty particular. They're picking, these are good specimens of young men, perfect in every way, and we're going to train them to be, to serve, in the court, and to serve in important roles. So it's a kind of a mixture if you put yourself in their place, if you think about it. On the one hand, you say, wow, this is a great opportunity. They're being taken back to this the place where you're being ruled from, to the palace. On the other hand, it's a great temptation because they're being taken to a land of idolatry. And that's a good part of the book of Daniel talks about their struggles. At least the first 6 chapters especially talk about how did they stand up to that. And that's why, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got thrown into the fiery furnace, and Daniel got thrown into the lion's den because they refused to worship the idols. They held strong to their faith. So that's kind of what a significant part of the book of Daniel is about what happened to these 4 young men. But it is interesting, they're probably only about teenagers when they were captured. Maybe their early 20s, something like that.
Yeah, the Hebrew word Yeladim means children, and it can mean anywhere from toddler to teenager, so they were definitely not adults.
They weren't adults, no. So, anything else you want to add here? Because
No.
Well, I'm trying to think of what I'm doing. But that's a good part of the history of that book. So you get an idea of who they are. All right, a few features of Daniel's prophecy. In the first 6 chapters of this book, Daniel furnishes historical information that shows how the Lord God of Israel displayed his truth in the court of the Babylonian ruler through the services of Daniel and his friends. Nebuchadnezzar, and then his successor, may have been his grandson, that's a little bit uncertain, was part of his family somehow, a relative, a guy by the name of Belshazzar. And so that was the Babylonian kingdom. And then the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians. And you may have heard of Cyrus, who was a Persian ruler, a Persian king. And he captured, and so Daniel ended up also serving under Cyrus. So these guys that got captured, their captors got defeated, and then suddenly they belonged to somebody else who was ruling. So it's it's more complicated than is apparent when you're reading through this. And you don't really need to remember the names and all this, but just when you read, well, wait a second, I thought Nebuchadnezzar was the king, and now they're talking about Belshazzar, and now they're talking about Cyrus, what's going on here? And all this happens without a whole lot of explanation of what's going on in there. So, I'm just looking down at my footnote before we go on here. I discovered this, and I thought this was interesting. This is footnote number 4 on the bottom of that page. The qualifications to be in the court, to have a high office in Babylonia. Anyone, if you would not be welcome if you have any imperfection of limb or countenance, whose eyes are not sound, who has any teeth missing, who has lost a finger, whose countenance has a sickly look, or who is pimpled. So, if you wanted to be, wanted to rise in the ranks, you better be
Perfect.
you better be perfect, yes.
Kind of judgmental.
And as far as that goes, I think no women need apply.
Right, yeah.
Pretty sure.
So that's kind of the clincher on that. But so these were some fine young men. That's why they were chosen. All right. Okay. Let's see. So the record does not show. I mean, these monarchs were all impressed with Daniel and his friends, but it doesn't show that they really experienced any change of heart or were converted or anything really changed. They still worship their gods. All right. The second part of the book, basically chapter 7, is a record of magnificent visions in which the prophet received further revelations concerning some of the themes and prophecies that appeared in the earlier chapters. A couple of passages of special interest today are the Messianic prophecies, including chapter 2, verse 44. The kingdom that will overcome all earthly kingdoms and will never be destroyed. That's part of a vision, and I don't want to get too much in because we'll talk about it in detail, but a vision in which Nebuchadnezzar saw a dream of a man with a gold hit, Sean, right? Chapter 2, you're going to be,
Yeah.
but anyway.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into it anyway. They're just, and Daniel explains that as there's, the kingdoms just get better and better as they go along. Okay, that's kind of the point. Okay, chapter 7, verses 13 to 28. This section begins with this description. That is Daniel's vision at night. I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. That's the quote from those verses. So who is the Son of Man and who is the Ancient of Days? For brownie points, if you can answer that. Yes, dear.
Son of Man is Jesus. Ancient of Days is God the Father.
That's how this is understood by us, right?
He didn't coach me.
Yeah, she learned that in college. Probably did. If not before. No, anyway, this is generally understood as a reference, and Jesus appropriates that title. He calls himself the Son of Man on occasion, and that's based on this verse. So I'm not going to explore that anymore. That we'll talk about when we get there some more. Chapters 9, 24 to 27 foretells the advent of the Anointed One. And again, we're not going to discuss this, but Christ alludes to this passage in Matthew 24:15. When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Now, forgive me, I'm not going to try to explain that. We may talk about that later, but that's a strange verse. But just making the point that Jesus drew from that reference in Daniel and saw it. So Jesus is referring to Daniel's words as a prophecy, as something that is true, and something reliable, and something that fits into predictions of the last times to some extent. So that gets complicated. All right. Authenticity of the book. The book contains many definite predictions of future events. That's led some scholars to doubt that this book was actually written by Daniel in the 6th century before Christ. So if it predicts something that happened in the 4th century before Christ, well, maybe it wasn't written until then. And it's just, so that's people who question the authenticity of that say that. So they would suggest it was written later, perhaps as an encouragement to Jews who were suffering from persecutions from the Greeks, maybe in the 2nd century. It's fair to say that there are some statements in Daniel that present unusual difficulties to Christian scholars, but both Shawn and I, as your teachers, are convinced that this was written in the 6th century by Daniel, that this is prophecy and prophecy is real. But if it's some difficulties, another fact that is helpful to understand that we don't know a whole lot about this period, about the Babylonian exile, except from what's in the Bible. So if some of this isn't clear, when you compare, well, what does the Bible say about this? Well, what does history say about this? Well, you compare notes, and generally speaking, you can find, okay, it fits together. Here's some cases where you don't have a whole lot of other extra biblical sources to say. So you don't have any way to confirm it or to contrast it. You don't have any way to say that this is true or not true. So that's just something to keep in mind. The reference to Daniel in 24:15 that I mentioned above is certainly evidence of the book's truth and importance. And if Jesus says this is what Daniel said, this is what Daniel is doing.
He
and
also
maybe
calls Daniel a prophet,
Ah.
which also lends credibility to the timing and that he was accurately prophesying the future.
Good point. So that's our task over the next several weeks, to try our best to study and consider this unique and challenging book together. And Shawn, if you want to...
I'd like to add just a couple of
Yep.
more comments about the actual location of Babylon that are in the Bible, just to remind us. The passages we're familiar with, for example, Genesis 11 talks about the Tower of Babel, same
Yes.
land, right?
Yep.
When Abram at that time was told to leave the land of Ur of the Chaldeans and go to Canaan, he was in Babylon, that same land, and that's where God told him to leave. And of course his father Terah started to leave but never made it, and then it passes on to Abraham. So it's a really significant piece of geography in the earth prophetically. So I just thought it was good to just remember those references too.
And it is generally assumed, I think, both as Christians and secularly, as this is where civilization got started. This is where, this is where Eden was. I mean, you have to be careful about trying to say too much about this because we don't have. But that whole area of the Tigris and Euphrates, that between the rivers, Mesopotamia, is kind of assumed to be the cradle of, that's where it all started. I don't know if that can be proven in a strict sense, but pretty good assumption. I was trying to look for a map here that
Here's
I
one.
have. You got a good map?
Yeah, I think so.
start here and really pass it around it to get an idea of where we're talking. This would be Babylonia. Or if you've got a Bible and you've got a map, you can look for it yourself. You don't have to look first. Actually, I can pass this one around this way. It's kind of bulky, but there's Babylonia. It's just good to have an idea, just like the chronology. It's just like good to have an idea. What are we talking about? Where are we talking about? We should have had a map in here. I don't think there must be some maps in this building somewhere.
Actually, I have a map in my notes. I have a map in my notes.
They got wet.
That I was gonna
You're
get
gonna
out
show.
next week.
We will be talking about all these.
Oh, yeah.
All these letters in more detail.
Well, I guess in school, I learned about the cradle of civilization, but I think that was when I was going to the Christian College. I don't know if
I
learning
think so.
world history.
I think in
that
world
was
history, most
later.
people assume that.
Okay,
Yeah,
most
whose Bible
recorded,
is
okay,
this?
sure.
Whose Bible is this?
Mine.
Okay.
Don't fall apart.
Can you pass it back around?
Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Just to please, please, please read chapter 1 before next week. Read it and be familiar with it, so it'll make this study a lot easier. Yes, chapter 1.
And as I said before, I think we're both committed to saying we're not going to try to, we got to get through this chapter in 45 minutes or less. So if you read through it and you have questions, bring them and say, read through it ahead of time, and we don't want to go too quick. We want to take time to reflect. So,
Is it mostly 6:30 to 7:30 or what?
Yes.
I'll try to shoot for that. I mean,
Yeah, sometimes it's a
if
little
we
late.
run over time a little bit, sometimes I
Yeah,
hope we'll accept
if we can
that.
be flexible with the ending time, it will help, because I kind of want to find a good place to end and
Right.
not rush too much.
But it's not an hour and a half.
No, we're going to target an hour.
Okay.
And if we wanted to bring snacks, we could
And
have
if
them.
everybody-
It goes out by 6:15.
And everybody will be eating.
Oh.
We did bring you some snacks too.
Hey, thank you. Well, that's what it
Well, I did have one other thing on the bottom of the page. You can see this is a psalm that expresses the sorrows felt by the Israelites, including perhaps Daniel and his friends, although this psalm is not necessarily connected with Daniel. But it is Israelites who were carried off to Babylon in the 6th century. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof, not the room, my bad, typing area. Cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. That's Psalm 137, verses 1 to 6. So that's a psalm that was composed by somebody during this era, during this time when Israel was in the battle. Is it time to break out the fruit?
Do we need plates or napkins? I guess we can read replacement for it.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's,
Did you say something about 6:15?
well, I was saying if you want to bring snacks.
Yeah.
Oh, did you need another?
Could any,
You didn't get one? Well, I did send it out.
yeah,
I did
we're
ask.
starting with the snacks, but remember last year we had a salad. That was nice. It was very nice. You want to do that again? If everybody wants to, I'm in.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Bring it up.
Excited about it.
Sean? I'll get,
Oh, man.
oh, wow, okay.
Well, here.
Okay, there's a little discussion going over here. They're wondering if we, well, how long ago was that? 3 years ago that we had?
Yeah, pre-COVID.
Yeah, pre-COVID.
Okay.
We had a Bible study on Wednesday night, and we had salad suppers, and then it ended up being just supper.
Yeah, I started out kind of simple, and I kind of grew.
Yeah, but it was great, and some of them are wanting that again, so we're just, that's the discussion here, how many
Well,
would like.
what did that look like? Did you eat first and then have a Bible study?
Yes, yes.
So we come
And
like
what-
at
what-
6. and-
What time worked for people? Because I don't know your schedules and stuff. What time worked?
I think we started at 6. Some people didn't quite make it,
Sure.
but, you know, they were a little bit
And then
late.
you
We didn't
started the
care, we
Bible
didn't
study
fire
at
them.
7?
Then they could.
6:30.
6:30.
Yeah, we had like 30 minutes.
So you
and we
grab your
started.
food and
And we
kind of
talked, and
Yes.
then we got.
Bible in one hand and fork in the other. I got it.
Yeah, if you were late, God didn't strike you dead. I mean,
Got a time to